Something about this story doesn't make sense. In the years after the deadliest wars Europe had ever seen, someone went back to the battlefields. Not to mourn. Not to bury the dead with dignity. They went back with shovels, carts, and contracts, and they left with bones. Hundreds of thousands of them. Millions, by some estimates. The bones of soldiers, of civilians, of men whose names had already been half forgotten by the time the guns went silent. And those bones were ground into powder, loaded onto ships, and scattered across the farmlands of England, to grow next season's wheat. We are told this was simply commerce. A practical solution to an agricultural problem. And perhaps that is all it was. But the deeper you look into the records, the shipping manifests, the parliamentary debates, the quiet complaints filed in newspapers that no one reads anymore, the more you begin to wonder whether the story we have been given is the complete one. Because in the early 19th century, a trade existed that was vast, organized, and largely invisible. And at its center were the bodies of the dead. To understand what happened, you have to understand the world that made it possible. The Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo. By conservative estimates, somewhere between 3 and 6 million soldiers died across the 2 decades of conflict that Napoleon Bonaparte set in motion. The fields of Europe, Austerlitz, Borodino, Leipzig, Waterloo itself, were soaked through with blood and littered with the unburied remains of men who had marched from France, Britain, Prussia, Russia, Spain, and a dozen other nations. These were not small engagements. At the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, sometimes called the Battle of Nations, over 90,000 men died in 4 days. At Borodino in 1812, Russian and French forces together suffered nearly 70,000 casualties in a single morning. The dead were buried hastily, shallowly, or not at all. Mass graves were dug when time permitted. Often it did not. In many cases, the bodies were simply left where they fell, and the local populations, farmers, villagers, priests, were left to manage what remained. For years after the fighting stopped, bones surfaced in the soil every spring as farmers plowed their fields. Children found skulls in ditches. Travelers reported the smell of old battlefields still hanging in the air years later. At the same time, across the English Channel, British agriculture was in crisis. The population of Britain was growing rapidly, from roughly 9 million in 1800 to over 14 million by 1830. Farmland was being exhausted. Yields were declining. Landowners and agricultural scientists were desperately searching for something, anything, that could restore the fertility of English soil. And the answer, it turned out, was phosphorus. Bone meal, ground animal bone, had been recognized since at least the late 18th century as a powerful soil fertilizer. Farmers who used it reported dramatically improved harvests. Demand for bones grew. And the bones of animals were no longer enough to meet it. It is impossible to say precisely when the trade in human bones began. These things rarely have clean starting points. But by the early 1820s, it was already well established enough to attract attention. In 1822, an English writer named Edward Stanhope reported, with some discomfort, that large quantities of human bones were being collected from the battlefields of Europe and shipped to the port of Hull in Yorkshire. From Hull, they traveled to processing mills in the surrounding countryside, where they were crushed, ground, and sold to farmers. Stanhope estimated that somewhere in the range of 3 million bushels of bones had passed through Hull in recent years. He did not appear to find this merely distasteful. He appeared to find it alarming. Other observers followed. In 1823, the issue reached the pages of a British farming journal, which noted with a strange mixture of pride and unease that the bones of the heroes of Waterloo were contributing to the fertility of English fields. The phrasing is striking. Not the bones of soldiers. The bones of heroes. As though the invocation of nobility might soften what was actually being described. The trade had a geography. Bones were collected from major battlefield sites, Waterloo in present-day Belgium, the sites of the Peninsula War in Spain and Portugal, the great killing fields of what is now Germany and Poland. Collectors, some local, some hired by British trading companies, would excavate mass graves, gather surface remains, and bundle them for transport. The bones were then shipped to British ports, primarily Hull and Grimsby, and distributed to mills. By the 1830s, the practice had expanded to include bones sourced from as far away as Sicily and Egypt. And beyond the battlefields, there were other sources too: catacombs, churchyards, institutions. The definition of what counted as a legitimate source appears to have been, at best, flexible. What makes the story strange is not simply that it happened. It is how quietly it happened. For a trade of this scale, and we are speaking, by some contemporary estimates, of hundreds of thousands of tons of material over several decades, the historical footprint is remarkably small. There are records, but they are scattered. There are accounts, but they are brief. It is as though the industry existed in a kind of official blind spot. As though no one in power particularly wanted to examine it too closely. The parliamentary record of this period is instructive, not for what it says, but for what it does not say. In the House of Commons debates of the 1820s and 1830s, agriculture is discussed at considerable length. The bone trade is mentioned, obliquely, in the context of import tariffs and the general movement of goods. But the question of where, precisely, the bones were coming from is never asked directly. Not in any session that has been easily recovered. The members of Parliament who represented agricultural districts, men who understood very well what bone meal was and how much of it their constituents were using, appear to have had no curiosity about the supply chain. The customs records at Hull are more specific. Historians who have examined them report steady and significant importation of bones from continental Europe throughout the 1820s, 1830s, and into the 1840s. The records list them simply as bones, alongside other agricultural commodities. No distinction is made between animal and human remains. Whether this was an oversight or a convenience is not recorded. There is a letter held in the archives of a Yorkshire Agricultural Society, written sometime around 1825, by a farmer who had been using imported bone meal on his fields for several seasons. He is writing to inquire about the quality of a recent shipment, which he found inconsistent. The letter is businesslike and unremarkable, except for one passage near the end, where he notes that his laborer had found what appeared to be a human tooth among the material. He asks, without evident distress, whether this was something the society had encountered before, and whether it affected the fertilizing properties of the product. The reply, if one was sent, has not survived. In Germany, the picture is somewhat clearer. Local newspapers in the regions surrounding the great Napoleonic battlefields occasionally publish complaints from civic leaders about the desecration of burial sites. In one account from a Prussian newspaper of the 1820s, a correspondent describes watching a group of men, he does not say who employed them, systematically excavating a known mass grave from the Battle of Leipzig. He estimates they removed enough material to fill several large wagons. He does not know where the wagons went, but he notes that they were headed west. When you begin to place these fragments alongside one another, a pattern starts to emerge. Not a conspiracy exactly, but something more like a system. A system that connected the devastation of war with the demands of industrial agriculture, through a supply chain that was efficient, profitable, and almost entirely unexamined by those in a position to regulate it. Historians who have studied this period, including Katrine Clay, who touched on the subject in her research into post-Napoleonic Europe, and various agricultural historians working in British regional archives, have noted that the bone trade occupied an unusual position in the economy of the time. It was significant enough to influence prices and policy, but invisible enough to escape sustained scrutiny. Several historians have used the word convenient to describe this invisibility, though they are careful about what conclusions they draw from it. There is also the question of who profited. The names of the major importing firms are not difficult to find. They appear in trade directories and port records. Several of them were substantial companies, connected to larger networks of agricultural commerce. Some had connections to landowners who sat in Parliament. This does not, by itself, prove anything. Conflicts of interest were not regulated in the 19th century the way they are today, and the relationship between commerce and legislation was far more direct. But it is worth noting that the people most positioned to ask questions about the trade were also, in some cases, among its beneficiaries. What is perhaps most striking is the timeline. The heaviest period of the bone trade coincides almost exactly with the years when the British agricultural sector was under its greatest strain, roughly 1820 to 1845. After the 1840s, two things happened simultaneously: the introduction of new chemical fertilizers, beginning with superphosphate in 1843, and a gradual fading of the bone trade from public record. Whether this reflects a genuine winding down of the practice or simply a shift in the sources of supply is, again, not entirely clear. There is a testimony, fragmentary and secondhand, recorded in an 1847 account of rural life in Belgium, written by a Flemish priest named Father Gerard Mays. He was compiling observations about the communities near Waterloo, and he included, almost as an aside, a recollection from an elderly local farmer who had been a young man at the time of the battle. The farmer described watching, over the course of several years after 1815, as groups of men came to the fields and dug. He said that at first, people assumed they were relatives of the dead, come to recover their loved ones. But the men were not grieving. They were working quickly, systematically. They loaded what they found into carts and drove away without ceremony. The farmer said the local people did not stop them. They did not know they could. And he said, and this is the detail that stays with you, that for the next several years, the harvests in that region were particularly good. He did not say this as an accusation. He said it as a simple observation. As though the connection were obvious and unremarkable. As though the dead had simply become part of the land. There is also a notice, published in a Dublin newspaper in 1831, which is more direct. It reports that several residents of a rural county had discovered that the bones recently delivered to local farms were not, as advertised, the bones of animals. A local physician had examined samples and concluded that a portion of them were human. The notice calls for an inquiry. Whether any inquiry followed, the record does not clearly show. And then there is the account of a mill worker in Yorkshire, recorded not in any official document but in a handwritten memoir discovered in the 1970s in a house clearance near Doncaster. The memoir was written decades after the events it describes, by a man who had worked as a laborer in a bone-grinding mill in the 1830s. He writes that the workers knew or suspected what some of the material was. He writes that they did not talk about it among themselves, not because they were forbidden to, but because talking about it seemed to make it worse. He describes the smell. He describes the dust that settled on everything. And he writes, at the end of that passage, that he never ate bread made from wheat without thinking about it. He does not explain what he meant. He moves on to another subject. What we are left with, when we gather all of these pieces together, is something that resists a clean conclusion. We know the trade existed. The shipping records, the parliamentary mentions, the agricultural journals, these establish that beyond reasonable doubt. We know it was large. Estimates of the volume involved, while imprecise, suggest that the quantity of bones imported into Britain during the peak decades was sufficient to account for human remains alongside animal ones, given what we know about the state of European battlefields. We know it was profitable, that it was connected to powerful commercial interests, and that it was not meaningfully investigated by any authority during the period in which it operated. What we do not know, and what the historical record has, perhaps conveniently, failed to preserve in detail, is the full extent of the human component. We do not know whether the companies involved knew and did not care, or knew and actively concealed it, or arranged their affairs so as never to be certain enough to be held accountable. We do not know how many of the farmers who used the fertilizer suspected what they were buying. We do not know whether the ground-up remains of soldiers who died at Waterloo, at Leipzig, at Badajoz, ended up growing the wheat that fed English cities in the 1830s. We suspect it. The evidence points in that direction. But the definitive accounting has never been made. There are archives in Brussels, in Leipzig, in London, that have not been fully examined on this question. There are trade records that historians have noted in passing and not pursued. There are regional German and Spanish newspapers from the 1820s and 1830s that have never been systematically searched for accounts of battlefield excavation. The story is there, in pieces, waiting. It has simply never been considered important enough to assemble. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling detail of all. Not that it happened. Not even that it was permitted to happen. But that a century and a half later, we still cannot say with confidence exactly how vast it was, because no one at any point felt compelled to find out. History has a tendency to bury its most uncomfortable chapters, not in secret, not through any grand conspiracy, but through the accumulated weight of indifference. We do not always suppress the things we would rather not know. Sometimes we simply decline to look. The men who died at Waterloo were mourned, in a fashion. Poems were written about them. Monuments were erected. Songs were composed. And then, quietly, some of them were ground into powder and scattered on English fields, and no one particularly objected, because the wheat grew tall and the price of bread stayed low and the machinery of commerce required no villains, only participants. The farmers who spread that fertilizer were not cruel men. The merchants who shipped the bones were not unusual men, by the standards of their time. The legislators who did not ask questions were not, in most cases, corrupt. They were simply incurious about the origins of useful things, in the way that people have always been incurious about the origins of useful things. What troubles us, looking back, is not the evil of it. It is the normalcy. The way it simply fit into the world without rupture, without outcry, without anyone standing up in the House of Commons and saying, "Stop. We should know what we are doing. We should at least know what we are doing." Perhaps the records that remain are complete. Perhaps the historians who have touched this subject have found everything there is to find, and the story is exactly as mundane as its participants believed it to be. A trade. A supply chain. A solution to an agricultural problem. Perhaps the bones of 300,000 men blended so thoroughly into the English soil that they became, in the truest sense, part of it, and this is simply a fact of the 19th century that we have not fully reckoned with. Or perhaps there is more in the archives. Perhaps the full accounting, if someone were patient enough to make it, would reveal a scale that even the more troubling estimates have not captured. Perhaps the silence in the official record is not coincidence but something more deliberate. A collective agreement, never quite stated, to let the dead stay useful without making too much noise about it. We do not know. And that not knowing after 2 centuries is its own kind of answer. The bones are gone. The fields are still there. And somewhere beneath the ordinary landscape of a continent that has forgotten most of what it cost to build, the evidence, if it survives at all, is very, very quiet.